Every loaf of bread has a story. Every bowl of pasta, every plate of food, built from grain that was planted, grown, harvested, and processed before it reached your table. Canada writes a significant chapter of that story for the entire world. The third largest wheat exporter on Earth, 34 million metric tons of some of the highest quality grain produced anywhere on the planet. Donald Trump demanded access to it this morning on American terms. Mark Carney refused, and the refusal landed not just in Washington, but in every grain market, every food ministry, and every agricultural trading desk on Earth that understands what happens when the world's third largest wheat exporter tells the world's largest economy that its demand was not a trade proposal. It was an overreach, and Canada does not accommodate overreach. Pull up a chair, because what happened in the wheat sector today is not simply another round of a familiar confrontation. It is the moment this trade war entered the one domain that connects economic policy to the most fundamental human necessity on Earth, food. Not oil that you can replace with renewable energy over time. Not aluminum that you can source from alternative producers. Not uranium that nuclear utilities can stockpile for years. Wheat, the grain that feeds billions of people. The commodity that sits at the foundation of food security for nations on every continent. Donald Trump reached for Canada's wheat this morning with the same logic he has applied to every previous resource demand in this confrontation. That Canadian creates Canadian vulnerability. That what Canada sells, America needs. That need creates leverage. That leverage produces compliance. The logic has failed 6 times before this morning. It failed again today, and the reason it keeps failing is the same reason it failed today. Carney understands the leverage better than the administration that keeps trying to use it. W.H. Washington demanded at 8:41 this morning the United States Department of Agriculture and the Office of the United States Trade Representative released a joint demand document addressed to the Government of Canada. The document described what it called an urgent requirement for guaranteed and preferential American access to Canadian wheat exports, Canadian grain processing capacity, and Canadian agricultural logistics infrastructure. The demand contained 4 specific requirements. The first required Canada to guarantee American grain buyers first right of refusal on Canadian wheat exports before any allocation was made to other international customers. In practical terms, this meant American buyers would have priority access over every other nation currently purchasing Canadian wheat, including the Middle Eastern, Asian, and African nations that depend on Canadian grain for a significant portion of their food supply. The second requirement demanded that Canada implement American-aligned grading and quality standards for wheat exports, effectively requiring Canada to restructure its grain grading system around American preferences, rather than the international standards Canada currently uses. The third requirement demanded preferential pricing for American wheat buyers through a joint pricing mechanism, giving American representatives influence over Canadian wheat export prices. The fourth requirement demanded that Canadian agricultural infrastructure, including grain terminals, storage facilities, and processing capacity, be made available to American commercial interests through investment access frameworks that had not been negotiated or agreed. Read those 4 requirements in sequence, and the underlying logic is consistent with every previous resource demand this administration has made. Take something Canada has, establish American priority access, influence the pricing, acquire the infrastructure, turn a Canadian sovereign resource into an American strategic asset managed through frameworks that give Washington institutional influence over Canadian resource decisions on a permanent basis. The administration had applied this template to oil, to uranium, to potash, to natural gas, to electricity. This morning, it applied it to wheat, and it sent the demand to a prime minister who had refused every previous version of this template with exactly the same answer he gave this morning: why wheat is personal. Before we get to Carney's refusal, I want to explain something about wheat specifically that makes this demand different in character from previous resource demands, even within the pattern they all share. Oil is strategic. Uranium is militarily significant. Potash feeds agriculture. Natural gas heats homes. All of those things matter enormously, but wheat feeds people directly. It goes from field to mill to bakery in a chain so short and so immediate that disrupting it produces consequences that are visible, personal, and politically impossible to ignore within weeks rather than months. Canada exports wheat to approximately 70 countries. Many of those countries are in regions where food security is fragile, where domestic grain production is insufficient, and where Canadian wheat represents not a commercial preference, but a nutritional necessity. When the United States demands American priority access to Canadian wheat exports before any allocation is made to other international customers, it is not simply making a trade demand. It is proposing that American commercial preferences take priority over food security in nations that depend on Canadian grain to feed their populations. That is not a trade argument. It is a food security argument, and Carney framed it exactly that way when he refused. Stay with us. This is the moment in this story where everything that has been building across 6 months of trade confrontation converges on the most fundamental question this confrontation has raised. Who controls the resources that feed the world? Canada has an answer. Carney is about to deliver it. If you are not subscribed, hit that button right now and turn on the notification bell. This is not a story you want to miss the next chapter of. Now let us get to Ottawa. How Carney refused. At 1:29 this afternoon, Mark Carney appeared before reporters in Ottawa. He was joined by Canada's Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food and the Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations World Food Programme. The presence of a World Food Programme ambassador told every journalist in the room before Carney spoke a single word that what Canada was about to say was not going to be framed as a bilateral trade response. It was going to be framed as something larger, something that extended beyond the Canada-US relationship into the global food system that Canadian wheat helps sustain. Carney began without preamble. He said Canada had received and reviewed the joint demand from the Department of Agriculture and the trade representative. He said Canada's answer was no. Then he explained why with the analytical precision that has characterized every significant statement he has made in this confrontation. He said the first demand, American priority access to Canadian wheat before any allocation to other international customers, would require Canada to deprioritize food supply commitments to nations that depend on Canadian wheat for their population's nutritional security. He named the categories of nations affected: nations in North Africa, nations in Sub-Saharan Africa, nations in South and Southeast Asia, nations in the Middle East, nations where food import dependency is high, domestic production is constrained, and Canadian wheat is not a commercial preference but a food security foundation. Canada will not establish American commercial priority over those nations' food security needs, not for any trade benefit, not under any pressure, not through any framework the administration can design. He said the second demand, American-aligned grading standards, would require Canada to restructure an agricultural quality framework that has been developed over a century of grain production expertise to serve Canadian producers, international buyers, and global market requirements. Canadian wheat grading standards are not a barrier to American access. They are a quality assurance system that makes Canadian wheat one of the most sought-after grain varieties in the world. Restructuring them around American preferences would damage the international market reputation that makes Canadian wheat valuable to every buyer, including American ones. He said the third demand, preferential pricing through an American-influenced joint mechanism, was the same pricing control provision the administration had attempted to insert into frameworks for oil, natural gas, and potash. The answer was identical to the answer Canada had given each time before. Canadian resources are priced through market mechanisms that reflect Canadian production costs, international market conditions, and Canadian commercial interests. American representation in a joint pricing mechanism is not a commercial arrangement. It is a foreign pricing authority over a Canadian resource. Canada does not accept foreign pricing authority over its resources, regardless of how that authority is structured or what it is called. He said the fourth demand, American investment access to Canadian agricultural infrastructure, would give American commercial entities operational presence in the physical infrastructure of Canadian food production and export. Canadian grain terminals, Canadian processing facilities, Canadian storage systems. These are not investment opportunities available for foreign acquisition through trade pressure. They are sovereign infrastructure serving Canadian agricultural interests and the international food security commitments Canada has made to its trading partners around the world. Then Carney announced three immediate actions that together represented Canada's response to the demand and something more significant than a response. The first was the formal submission of Canada's Wheat Export Commitment Framework to the United Nations World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The submission documented Canada's existing wheat export commitments to food-insecure nations and formally registered those commitments as Canadian sovereign obligations that supersede any bilateral trade demand from any single importing nation, regardless of its economic size. Canada was placing its food security commitments in the international record as protected obligations, not as diplomatic gestures, as documented sovereign commitments with international institutional standing. The second was the announcement that Canada had finalized long-term wheat supply agreements with 7 nations in the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, providing supply certainty at stable prices for 5 years. The agreements had been under negotiation for several months. They were being finalized and announced today. Specifically because the American demand for priority access had created the political and diplomatic justification for locking in alternative market commitments that would permanently reduce the proportion of Canadian wheat subject to American market pressure. The third was the activation of Canada's agricultural sovereignty framework, covering wheat and all other Canadian grain exports. Under this framework, the Canada Grain Commission was directed to treat all export allocation decisions as national interest determinations, requiring assessment of Canadian food security obligations, international humanitarian commitments, and sovereign commercial interests before any allocation was made to any buyer. The framework made explicit what Carney had been saying throughout this confrontation. Canadian resources serve Canadian interests and Canadian international obligations first. The bilateral relationship with the United States is one consideration among many in that assessment. It is not the overriding consideration, and no demand from Washington will make it so. The reaction global grain markets moved immediately after Carney's statement reached trading desks. Canadian wheat futures rose as the long-term supply agreements with Middle Eastern and African buyers established a floor under Canadian export volumes that reduced market uncertainty about Canadian supply availability. International. Wheat prices moved modestly as traders processed the implications of a significant portion of Canadian export capacity being locked into long-term agreements that reduced spot market availability for buyers without existing supply relationships. Inside the United States, the reaction divided along the lines that have characterized every previous resource demand response in this confrontation. Agricultural state senators, who had been managing constituent concerns throughout the trade war, received new rounds of calls from American grain buyers concerned about the long-term agreements Canada had announced with non-American customers. The concern was commercial and immediate. If Canadian wheat export capacity is increasingly committed to long-term agreements with Middle Eastern and African buyers, American buyers seeking Canadian wheat in future seasons will be competing for a smaller pool of uncommitted supply at prices set by tighter market conditions. The demand designed to secure American access to Canadian wheat had produced a Canadian response that reduced future American access more concretely than any previous measure. The World Food Programme issued a statement welcoming Canada's submission of its export commitment framework and its formalization of supply agreements with food-insecure nations. Several governments whose food security depends on Canadian wheat released statements thanking Canada for its commitment to maintaining supply relationships that serve their population's needs. The international dimension of Carney's response was operating exactly as it had been designed to operate. By framing the refusal around food security obligations to vulnerable nations, Canada had made the American demand internationally visible as something that proposed American commercial priority over humanitarian food supply needs. That framing was not simply diplomatic, it was analytically accurate, and its accuracy made it impossible to dispute without the administration explicitly arguing that American commercial preferences should supersede food security in nations that depend on Canadian grain. 3 scenarios from here. In the first scenario, the international food security framing of Canada's refusal and the domestic American concern about reduced future wheat access combine to produce enough pressure that the administration withdraws the wheat demand within 30 days. The long-term agreements Canada has signed with Middle Eastern and African buyers remain in place as permanent commercial relationships that serve Canadian agricultural interests independent of the bilateral dispute resolution. Canada's agricultural sovereignty framework remains as permanent policy infrastructure governing all future grain export decisions. A broader bilateral negotiating process begins that does not include wheat access demands because the international and domestic political cost of maintaining them has been made visible and concrete. In the second scenario, the administration escalates by implementing trade measures specifically targeting Canadian agricultural exports to the American market. Canada activates its full agricultural countermeasure suite, directing retaliatory tariffs at American farm goods in the states generating the most consistent political pressure on the administration. The combination of Canadian counter-tariffs on American agricultural exports and reduced Canadian wheat availability for American buyers as long-term agreements commit increasing supply to non-American customers creates agricultural sector economic consequences on the American side that exceed anything the previous rounds of this confrontation produced. The political pressure from American agricultural communities reaches a level that produces genuine administration flexibility within 60 days. In the third scenario, Canada's formalization of long-term wheat supply agreements with food-insecure nations and its submission of export commitments to international food institutions produces a durable realignment of Canadian agricultural trade relationships. The Middle Eastern, North African, and Sub-Saharan African nations that receive long-term supply certainty from Canada develop deeper commercial and diplomatic relationships with Ottawa that extend beyond the wheat file into broader agricultural technology, water management, and food system development cooperation. Canada emerges from the trade confrontation as a more significant actor in global food security governance than it was when the confrontation began. The demand that was designed to subordinate Canadian wheat to American commercial preferences has instead connected Canadian agricultural capacity more deeply to the global food system that depends on it. What the refusal means. Every loaf of bread has a story. This morning, Donald Trump tried to rewrite Canada's chapter of that story. He tried to make American commercial access the first paragraph, the priority, the overriding claim on Canadian grain before any other nation's food security need was considered. Carney refused to let him. Not with anger, not with drama, with a precise, documented, internationally submitted refusal that placed Canada's food security obligations to vulnerable nations in the permanent record of international institutions before Washington could frame the demand as anything other than what it was. Canadian wheat feeds the world. Canada decides who gets it, when they get it, at what price, and through what commercial arrangements. That is sovereignty. That is what Carney has been defending since the first day of this confrontation across every resource, every payment system, every shipping lane, and every legal filing this trade war has produced. Today, he defended it in the domain where the stakes are most immediate and most human, the domain of food. And the refusal he delivered will be read not just in Washington, but in every capital where governments are watching Canada and learning what it looks like when a nation decides that its sovereign resources serve its sovereign interests and its international obligations, not the demands of whoever applies the most pressure, not the terms of whoever has the larger economy. Canada's interests, Canada's obligations, Canada's decision, always. We will be following every development as this story continues. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening. We are on this story around the clock. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.